heavy cruiser hit 45 times by battleship shells at point-blank range, and she refused to die. The USS San Francisco absorbed punishment that should have sent her to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound in minutes, yet she survived, fought back, and helped sink a Japanese battleship in the process. What made this possible wasn't armor or luck. It was the crew's refusal to surrender even after their captain and admiral were killed instantly on the bridge. I've analysed Medal of Honor citations, after-action reports from both navies, and survivor testimonies spanning 5 decades to reconstruct what happened during those 13 minutes of hell. You're about to discover the split-second targeting decision that doomed the bridge crew, how a junior officer took command from a burning wreck of a ship with no steering, and why the Japanese lost their best chance to retake Guadalcanal. November 12th, 1942. 2,347 hours. Captain Cassin Young stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, staring into absolute darkness. No moon, no stars. Just the black void of Iron Bottom Sound, and the faint phosphorescence of the ship's wake cutting through tropical waters. His hands gripped the bridge railing as the cruiser's engines thrummed beneath his feet, pushing 13,000 tons of steel at 20 knots toward an enemy he couldn't see, but knew was out there. Young was 43 years old, a career naval officer who'd already earned the Medal of Honor 15 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, as executive officer of the repair ship USS Vestal, he'd been blown overboard by the explosion that tore through the USS Arizona. He'd swum back through burning oil, climbed aboard his ship, and directed firefighting efforts that saved the Vestal from destruction. The Navy had given him a medal and a promotion. Now they'd given him the San Francisco, a treaty cruiser armed with 9 8-inch guns, and a crew of over 1,000 men who trusted him to bring them home. Tonight, Young knew that might not be possible. Behind him on the bridge stood Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan, a soft-spoken officer who'd been President Roosevelt's naval aide before taking command of the surface forces at Guadalcanal. Callaghan had made the San Francisco his flagship for this mission, which meant Young's bridge was crowded with extra staff officers, communications personnel, and the Admiral's tactical team. It made the space feel cramped. Too many bodies pressed into the armoured citadel as they sailed toward combat. The crew knew what was coming. They'd received the intelligence reports. A massive Japanese fleet, 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 14 destroyers, was steaming down the slot from Rabaul, heading straight for Guadalcanal. The Japanese called these runs the Tokyo Express, high-speed night missions to reinforce and resupply their forces. But tonight's mission was different. Tonight, they were bringing the battleships Hiei and Kirishima to bombard Henderson Field, the critical American air base on Guadalcanal, and turn it into a crater field. Without Henderson Field, the Marines on Guadalcanal were doomed. Without the Marines, the entire Solomon Islands campaign would collapse. Admiral Callaghan had been given a desperate order: stop them. His force was outgunned, outweighed, and sailing into a night battle where confusion would be as deadly as enemy fire. 5 cruisers, San Francisco, Portland, Helena, Juneau, and Atlanta, plus 8 destroyers against a force built around 2 36,000-ton battleships. The Hiei alone displaced more than Callaghan's entire cruiser force combined and carried 14-inch guns that could punch through cruiser armor like tissue paper. Young understood the mathematics. This wasn't a battle they were supposed to win. This was a battle they had to fight anyway. The crew had been at battle stations since sunset. In the gun turrets, sweating crews stood ready beside their 8-inch rifles. In the magazines deep below the waterline, men stacked powder bags and shells on hoists, waiting for the fire control order. In damage control stations throughout the ship, sailors checked pumps, hoses, and repair equipment. In the sick bay, pharmacists' mates laid out morphine, tourniquets, and surgical instruments. Everyone knew what was at stake. Everyone knew the odds. What they didn't know was that in less than 20 minutes, most of the men on the bridge would be dead. The San Francisco plowed through the darkness at the head of Callaghan's column, the flagship leading 13 other warships in a single line. It was the standard formation for night combat, ships following their leader in column so they wouldn't accidentally ram each other in the darkness. But it also meant the San Francisco would be first into whatever hell waited ahead. Young checked his watch. Almost midnight. The Japanese would be close now, probably already inside Iron Bottom Sound, heading for the bombardment positions off Lunga Point. If Callaghan's intelligence was correct, the two forces would collide within minutes. On the bridge, radar operators hunched over their equipment, watching glowing green scopes for contacts. The San Francisco's radar was primitive by later standards. It could detect large targets at maybe 15 miles in good conditions. But it couldn't distinguish between ships, couldn't tell friend from enemy, couldn't provide accurate firing solutions. In the darkness of a night battle, radar was barely better than lookouts straining to see shapes against the black water. But what Admiral Callaghan and Captain Young didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their formation was about to sail directly between the two Japanese battleships. The Hiei was approaching from the northwest. The American column was steaming northeast. The geometry was catastrophic. Instead of crossing the T or maintaining fighting distance, the Americans were about to find themselves at point-blank range, surrounded by enemy ships, in a melee where their numerical advantage meant nothing and confusion would reign supreme. At 0124 hours, radar operators reported contacts ahead. Multiple ships, range closing rapidly. Admiral Callaghan ordered the column to change course, trying to position his ships for a gun battle. But in the darkness, with limited radar and no combat experience working together as a unified force, the American formation began to disintegrate. Ships lost sight of the vessel ahead. Courses diverged. The neat column became a scattered formation stumbling blindly toward the enemy. Young felt the deck tilt slightly as the San Francisco turned. Around him, officers were talking in clipped, tense voices, trying to make sense of the radar contacts. Which were American ships? Which were Japanese? At what range should they open fire? The darkness made every decision agonizing. Open fire too early on a friendly ship and you'd slaughter your own men. Wait too long and the enemy would fire first. At 0141 hours, a searchlight stabbed across the water from a Japanese ship. A brilliant white beam that illuminated an American destroyer barely 2,000 yards away. In night combat, searchlights were death sentences for both sides. The ship using the light exposed itself, but also illuminated targets for friendly ships. The darkness exploded into chaos. Guns opened fire from every direction. Tracers arced across the water in curving streams of light. Star shells burst overhead, bathing the scene in flickering, hellish illumination that turned ships into ghostly silhouettes. The San Francisco's main battery roared, 8-inch shells screaming toward Japanese targets. Explosions erupted across the water as shells found targets, tore through thin destroyer hulls, detonated magazines. But in the chaos and darkness and at these impossibly close ranges, nobody could tell who was shooting at whom. The San Francisco's lookouts spotted a large shape emerging from the darkness off the starboard bow. Massive, angular, unmistakably a capital ship. Captain Young and Admiral Callaghan stared at the silhouette. Was it the battleship? The range was less than 3,000 yards. Point-blank range for naval combat, close enough to see details even in the darkness and gun flash. The ship was so close that the San Francisco's 8-inch guns were almost firing flat rather than in the high arcs of long-range combat. What Young and Callaghan didn't realize, what they couldn't realize in the darkness and confusion, was that they were looking at the Japanese battleship Hiei. 36,000 tons of steel, armor and firepower, 8 14-inch guns in 4 turrets, plus a secondary battery that could shred a cruiser. The Hiei had been built to fight other battleships, not cruisers. The San Francisco, for all her firepower, was a light opponent by comparison. But Admiral Callaghan made a decision that would save the mission and doom his flagship. He ordered the San Francisco to engage. The San Francisco's main battery opened fire on the Hiei at a range of less than 3,000 yards. 8-inch shells slammed into the battleship's superstructure, tore through her upperworks, started fires, killed crew. The American cruiser was hitting the Japanese giant again and again, pouring shells into her at a rate that should have been impossible. But 8-inch shells couldn't penetrate the Hiei's main armor belt. They could damage, could wound, could kill exposed crew, but they couldn't sink her. What Captain Young and Admiral Callaghan didn't know was that other American ships, confused in the darkness, were about to fire on the San Francisco. The USS Atlanta, a light anti-aircraft cruiser positioned somewhere in the chaos, spotted a large warship firing at what her crew believed was an American ship. In the confusion of night battle, with muzzle flashes and searchlights creating a hellscape of light and shadow, the Atlanta's captain made the split-second decision that his doctrine required. He opened fire on what he thought was an enemy cruiser. 19 5-inch shells slammed into the San Francisco's superstructure in rapid succession. The friendly fire was devastating. The shells tore through the bridge area, killed men at their stations, knocked out fire control equipment, and, critically, destroyed the ship's steering mechanism. The San Francisco lurched as her rudder jammed hard to port. Captain Young felt the deck cant beneath his feet as the cruiser began a violent turn she couldn't control. Officers shouted reports, trying to understand what had happened. The steering room wasn't responding. The helm was dead. The ship was out of control, swinging in a wide arc through waters filled with friendly and enemy vessels, her momentum carrying her deeper into the Japanese formation. But the worst was yet to come. The Hiei's fire control officers had been watching the American cruiser that had dared to engage them at point-blank range. Through the darkness and gunsmoke, they'd tracked the San Francisco's silhouette, measured the range, calculated the firing solution. The battleship's main battery trained on the American flagship. 14-inch guns that could throw a shell weighing over 1,400 pounds with enough velocity to punch through 16 inches of armor plate. Against a heavy cruiser's bridge, which had perhaps 3 inches of armor protection, these shells would be unstoppable. At 0150 hours, the Hiei fired. The salvo that left her forward turrets would change everything. The shells crossed the 3,000-yard gap in seconds, traveling faster than sound, arriving before their own thunder. The first 14-inch shell struck the San Francisco's forward superstructure just below the bridge level. It punched through the ship's structure like a hammer through plywood, the armor-piercing round continuing its trajectory through spaces never designed to stop such massive projectiles. The explosion was catastrophic. The shell detonated inside the bridge area, and in an instant, the command structure of both the ship and the American force ceased to exist. Captain Cassin Young died immediately, the Medal of Honor recipient who'd survived Pearl Harbor, who'd swum through burning oil to save his ship, who'd been given this command as recognition of his courage. He was killed in a fraction of a second by shellfire he never saw coming. Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan died beside him, the task force commander killed before he could issue another order. The Admiral's entire staff died in the same explosion. Fire control officers, communications personnel, lookouts, everyone on the bridge or in the immediate superstructure died in that single strike, or in the 14-inch shells that followed immediately after. The San Francisco's bridge became a slaughterhouse. Bodies were thrown across the wreckage. Men were killed by the blast, by shrapnel, by the overpressure wave that turned human tissue to pulp. The few who survived the initial explosions were burned by flash fires or crushed by collapsing structure. The ship's executive officer, Commander Mark Kruter, was wounded, but alive. The navigator, Commander Ray Arison, was alive but in shock. Most of the bridge crew was simply gone. More 14-inch shells followed. The Hiei was firing for effect now, walking her salvos across the American cruiser's length. Shells struck the foremast, toppling radar antennas and fire control directors. A shell penetrated through the hangar deck, started fires among aviation gasoline stores. Another shell struck near the forward smokestack, tore through crew berthing spaces, killed men in their bunks who were supposed to be at battle stations but had been thrown there by earlier damage. The San Francisco was being systematically destroyed by a ship that outweighed her nearly 3-1. But the Hiei wasn't the only Japanese ship firing at the American flagship. The heavy cruiser Kirishima had also found the range. Her 8-inch guns added to the bombardment, shells slamming into the San Francisco's hull and superstructure. Destroyer guns joined in, smaller caliber, but no less deadly to expose personnel and unarmored sections. The American cruiser was being hit from multiple directions, taking fire from vessels she couldn't even see in the darkness. The count would be verified later when damage control parties could assess the wreckage. 45 major caliber hits, 14-inch shells from the IEI, 8-inch shells from Japanese cruisers, 6-inch shells from destroyers, 5-inch shells from the Atlanta's friendly fire. Each hit tore into the ship, started fires, killed crew, destroyed equipment. The San Francisco should have rolled over and sunk. The mathematics of naval warfare said she couldn't survive this level of damage. But the ship refused to die. What the Japanese couldn't know, what would only become clear in the aftermath, was that American damage control training and design philosophy had created a level of survivability that Japanese designers hadn't anticipated. The San Francisco's compartmentalization, her damage control parties stationed throughout the ship, her crew's training in firefighting and flood control, all of it combined to keep her fighting, even as she absorbed punishment that would have sunk other vessels. In the after-conning station, a secondary control position located behind and below the main bridge, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless heard the explosions that killed his captain and admiral. He felt the ship lurch as steering was lost. He watched as communication with the bridge went dead, as fire control systems failed, as reports flooded in of casualties and damage throughout the ship. McCandless was 31 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who'd been aboard the San Francisco for less than a year. He'd never commanded a ship in combat. He'd never expected to command this ship at all. But now he was the senior surviving officer capable of taking command. And the ship was out of control, on fire, surrounded by enemy vessels and still taking hits. McCandless made the decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor. He took command from the after-conning station and began fighting back. He couldn't steer the ship. The rudder was jammed and hydraulics were damaged. He couldn't communicate with most of the crew. The internal communication systems were wrecked. He couldn't coordinate with the other American ships. The radio was damaged, and Admiral Callaghan was dead. But he could keep the guns firing. McCandless ordered the remaining functional gun directors to continue engaging targets. The San Francisco's main battery turrets, surprisingly, were still mostly operational despite the carnage above them. The 8-inch guns continued to fire, their crews working by training and instinct, loading and firing at whatever targets they could identify in the chaos. The ship's 5-inch secondary battery joined in, throwing shells at Japanese destroyers that emerged from the darkness. What McCandless didn't know yet was that the San Francisco's earlier fire, the shells Captain Young had ordered into the Hiei before the bridge was destroyed, had done critical damage to the Japanese battleship. The American 8-inch shells hadn't penetrated the Hiei's armor belt, but they'd torn through her superstructure, destroyed fire control systems, killed bridge personnel, and, critically, damaged steering mechanisms. The Hiei was also out of control now, circling in the darkness, unable to maintain formation, vulnerable, but that victory was in the future. In the present, McCandless was fighting to save his ship from minute to minute. The San Francisco was still taking hits. Fires burned in multiple compartments. The forward part of the ship, including the devastated bridge area, was an inferno. Wounded men were scattered throughout the vessel, some trapped in damaged compartments, others crawling toward aid stations through smoke and darkness. The ship's medical personnel were overwhelmed, trying to treat injuries that ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic burns and trauma. In Damage Control Central, Chief Boatswain's mate Reinhardt Keppler directed firefighting efforts with the kind of professional competence that saves ships in combat. Keppler had been in the Navy for 19 years, had served on battleships and cruisers, knew damage control procedures by instinct. He coordinated pump operations, directed hose teams, prioritized which fires to fight first and which compartments to abandon. His decisions, made in darkness and chaos while the ship was still under fire, kept the San Francisco afloat. Throughout the ship, individual sailors performed acts of courage that would never be officially recognized because there was no one alive to witness them or write them down. Men dragged wounded shipmates from burning compartments. Engineers kept boilers operating despite steamline damage that filled their spaces with superheated vapor. Gunners continued loading and firing even as shells exploded around them. Magazine crews passed ammunition up through hoists while wondering if the next Japanese shell would detonate the powder bags they were handling and blow the entire ship apart. The engagement had lasted 13 minutes when the firing began to slacken. The Japanese formation, as confused and disorganized as the American force, began to withdraw. The Hiei, damaged and out of control, limped away into the darkness. Other Japanese ships, having taken damage from the chaotic close-range melee, broke off contact. The Americans, what remained of their force, stopped firing as targets disappeared from radar and visual range. Silence fell across Iron Bottom Sound, broken only by the crackle of fires, the groans of wounded men, and the hiss of water pouring into damaged compartments. Lieutenant Commander McCandless stood in the afterconning station, trying to assess what had just happened. His ship was a wreck. The bridge was gone. The captain was dead. The admiral was dead. Steering was gone. Multiple fires were burning. Casualties were catastrophic. But the San Francisco was still afloat. Her engines still functioned, and her guns could still fire if needed. What McCandless couldn't see yet, what wouldn't become clear until dawn, was that his crippled ship had accomplished something extraordinary. Dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound on November 13th, 1942, revealing a scene from hell. The water was thick with oil, debris, and bodies. Wrecked ships lay scattered across the sound, some sinking, some already gone, others burning like torches in the early morning light. The USS San Francisco drifted among the wreckage, her steering still jammed, her forward superstructure a twisted mass of blackened steel, smoke pouring from a dozen holes in her hull and deck. Lieutenant Commander McCandless had spent the night fighting to keep his ship alive. With no steering control, the San Francisco had wallowed in circles through the darkness, her damaged rudder forcing her into a slow, endless turn. Engineering crews had rigged emergency steering connections, trying to regain some control, but the hydraulic damage was too severe. The best they could manage was to use the engines, speeding up one shaft, slowing the other, to crude effect. It was like trying to steer a car by using only the gas pedal and brake on opposite wheels. But they were afloat. Against all odds, against 45 major caliber hits, against the loss of her entire command structure, the San Francisco had survived the night. As daylight strengthened, McCandless ordered a full damage assessment. The reports that came back were staggering. The bridge and flag bridge were total losses, nothing but wreckage and bodies. The forward fire control director was destroyed. The foremast was damaged and listing. Multiple 8-inch gun mounts had taken damage, though most were still functional. The hangar deck was burned out. Crew berthing spaces throughout the forward section were destroyed. The sick bay was overwhelmed with wounded. The casualty count was still being compiled, but McCandless knew it would be devastating. Over 70 men dead, including the captain, the admiral, and most of the senior staff. More than 100 wounded, many critically. The San Francisco's crew of over 1,000 had been gutted in 13 minutes of combat, but the ship herself refused to die. Her engineering plant was intact. Her boilers still made steam. Her shafts still turned. Her hull, despite multiple penetrations, was holding. American damage control design had proven itself in the most brutal test imaginable. The compartmentalization that divided the ship into hundreds of watertight sections meant that flooding in one area didn't doom the entire vessel. The redundancy of systems meant that when primary steering failed, emergency systems could take over. The training that every sailor received in firefighting meant that dozens of small fires never became one uncontrollable inferno. Chief Boatswain's mate Keppler had been everywhere during the night. His white uniform turned black with smoke and oil, directing damage control parties with the authority of a man who knew his job better than anyone else aboard. He'd made the critical decisions about which compartments to flood, which fires to fight, which equipment to prioritize. Now in daylight, he surveyed his handiwork. The ship looked like a wreck, but she was a floating wreck, and that meant they could save her. McCandless ordered the crew to begin recovering bodies from the bridge area. It was grim work. The 14-inch shells had caused catastrophic damage, and many of the dead couldn't be identified. Captain Young's body was found in the wreckage, identified by his uniform and Naval Academy ring. Admiral Callaghan's body was nearby, both men killed instantly by the same explosion. The bridge crew, the fire control officers, the communications personnel, all dead or gravely wounded. Commander Ray Arison, the navigator, had somehow survived despite being on the bridge during the shelling. He'd been thrown against a bulkhead by the blast, suffered a concussion and shrapnel wounds, but lived. He made his way to the after conning station to assist McCandless, though he was clearly in shock, moving mechanically through duties while his mind processed the horror of seeing everyone around him killed. But what McCandless learned as reports came in from other American ships changed the nature of their sacrifice. The battle had been costly. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers sunk and several destroyers heavily damaged. But the Japanese had suffered too. And critically, they'd failed their mission. Henderson Field had not been bombarded. The Japanese battleships had withdrawn before reaching their firing positions. The mission that the San Francisco and her sister ships had sailed out to stop, the destruction of the American airbase on Guadalcanal, had been prevented. The Marines were safe, the airfield was operational, and most importantly, the Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled and struggling to escape. The Hiei's damage, inflicted largely by the San Francisco's 8-inch shells in those desperate minutes before the bridge was destroyed, had proven catastrophic. The American shells had wrecked her steering, damaged her superstructure, killed key personnel, and left her unable to keep pace with the rest of the Japanese fleet. As dawn broke, the Hiei was alone, limping northward, trying to escape before American aircraft from Henderson Field could find her. They found her at 06:15 hours. Dive bombers from the Marine Corps squadrons on Guadalcanal, the same squadrons that would have been destroyed if the Japanese bombardment had succeeded, spotted the massive battleship struggling through the waters north of Savo Island. The Hiei was already trailing oil, listing slightly, her speed reduced to barely 18 knots. She was a cripple, and the Marine pilots knew it. The first attack runs began at 06:30 hours. Dauntless dive bombers screamed down on the battleship, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at the last possible moment before pulling up through the Hiei's anti-aircraft fire. The battleship's defensive armament was formidable, over 100 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, but her fire control had been damaged in the night battle. Her gunners fired blindly, filling the sky with flak, but the Marines pressed their attacks. Bombs struck the Hiei's deck, penetrated her armor, started fires deep within the ship. Torpedo planes from Henderson Field joined the attack, launching torpedoes that slammed into the battleship's hull below the waterline. Each torpedo opened new wounds, let more water flood into compartments, increased the list. The Hiei's damage control parties fought desperately, just as the San Francisco's crew had fought through the night. But the cumulative damage was too much. By noon, the Hiei was doomed. Her engines were flooded. Her steering was gone completely. Fires raged out of control in multiple compartments. The decision was made to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers came alongside to take off survivors while American aircraft continued their attacks, determined to ensure the battleship wouldn't survive to fight again. At 18:15 hours on November 13th, 1942, the battleship Hiei rolled over and sank. She was the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II, a powerful symbol of Japanese naval might sent to the bottom by a combination of the San Francisco's desperate close-range gunnery and relentless American air attacks. Her loss would shock the Imperial Japanese Navy and validate the sacrifice of the American ships that had fought in Iron Bottom Sound the night before. Lieutenant Commander McCandless, receiving the news of the Hiei's sinking aboard the still drifting San Francisco, understood what it meant. His captain and admiral had died, but their mission had succeeded. The battleship that had destroyed the San Francisco's bridge, that had killed 77 men, that had turned their ship into a floating wreck, was gone. The Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal had been stopped. Henderson Field was safe. The Marines could hold. But understanding the strategic victory didn't make the tactical reality any easier. The San Francisco was barely controllable, listing 5 degrees to starboard from flooding, fires still burning in several compartments. The wounded needed immediate evacuation to proper medical facilities. The dead needed to be buried. The ship needed to be saved. Other American vessels came alongside to assist. The destroyer USS Fletcher took the San Francisco under tow, though the heavy cruiser's mass made it difficult to maneuver. Medical personnel transferred to the San Francisco to help treat the wounded. Damage control specialists came aboard to assess whether the ship could make it to port under her own power or would need continuous tow assistance. The decision was made to attempt the journey to Espiritu Santo, the closest American base with repair facilities, some 600 nautical miles southeast of Guadalcanal. It would be a slow, agonizing voyage. The San Francisco could only make about 8 knots with her damaged steering, and the need to use engines for directional control. The trip would take 3 days. 3 days during which Japanese submarines might find them, during which the weather might turn, during which any of the dozens of damaged systems might fail catastrophically. McCandless organized the crew for the journey. Damage control parties worked around the clock, shoring up bulkheads, pumping out flooded compartments, fighting spot fires that kept reigniting. The engineering department nursed the boilers and engines, watching for any sign of failure. The medical staff worked with insufficient supplies and equipment to keep the wounded alive until they could reach proper hospitals. Chief Keppler barely slept, moving through the ship constantly, checking on repairs, encouraging exhausted sailors, ensuring that the temporary fixes held. His expertise, his calm competence in the face of catastrophe, had saved the ship during the battle. Now it would save her during the long limp home. On the second day of the journey, November 14th, the crew held funeral services for Captain Young, Admiral Callaghan, and the other dead who could be identified. McCandless conducted the service on the fantail. The surviving crew assembled in dress whites that were stained with oil and smoke. Bodies were committed to the sea, sliding from beneath flags into the Pacific, adding to the hundreds of American sailors already lying in Iron Bottom Sound. McCandless read from the service, his voice steady despite the exhaustion and trauma of the past 48 hours. He spoke of Captain Young's courage, his Medal of Honor from Pearl Harbor, his leadership. He spoke of Admiral Callaghan's dedication to duty, his decision to engage despite impossible odds. He spoke of the crew, the men who'd kept fighting after their leaders were killed, who'd saved their ship through skill and determination. What McCandless didn't say, what he didn't need to say because every man present understood it, was that they'd won. The mission had succeeded. The Japanese had been stopped. Henderson Field stood. The Marines held Guadalcanal. The strategic balance in the Solomon Islands had shifted, and the Hiei, the battleship that had seemed invincible in the darkness, lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, destroyed by the ship she'd tried to kill. The San Francisco reached Espiritu Santo on November 16th, 4 days after the battle. She entered port under her own power, her engines still turning, her battle ensigns still flying, despite 45 shell holes and a bridge that looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Sailors from other ships lined the rails to watch her pass, seeing the damage, understanding what she'd endured. The repair assessment would take weeks, but the preliminary conclusion was clear. The San Francisco could be saved. She'd need a new bridge, new fire control systems, extensive hull repairs, replacement of damaged compartments and equipment. The work would take months, but she'd return to service, fight again, survive the war. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. Citation reading in part. Throughout the entire night action, he exhibited fine leadership and great courage in the face of tremendous odds. It was an understatement. McCandless had taken command of a ship with no steering, no command structure, fires burning throughout, surrounded by enemy vessels, and kept her fighting. His decisions had saved the San Francisco and her crew. Chief Boatswain's mate Reinhardt Keppler would be killed in action 2 years later, serving aboard another ship. But his contribution to the San Francisco's survival would be remembered by every man who'd been aboard that night. Professional competence, honed by years of training and experience, had proven as valuable as courage under fire. The San Francisco herself would eventually receive the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a ship could earn. The citation would note her valiant performance and indomitable fighting spirit. But the real measure of her achievement wasn't in medals or citations. It was in the fact that she'd taken punishment that should have killed her, absorbed 45 major caliber hits, lost her captain and admiral, had her steering destroyed and her bridge obliterated, and she'd refused to sink. The San Francisco arrived at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in San Francisco Bay on December 11, 1942, exactly 1 month after the battle. She'd made the long journey from Espiritu Santo to Pearl Harbor, then across the Pacific to California, her crew nursing damaged systems every mile of the way. When she entered the shipyard basin, workers lined the docks to see the ship that newspapers were already calling the ship that would not die. The photographs of her wrecked bridge, published in papers across America, had become iconic images of naval combat brutality and American resilience. The repair work revealed just how catastrophic the damage had been. Naval architects and damage control experts who examined the San Francisco were astonished she'd remained afloat. The 14-inch shell that had killed Captain Young and Admiral Callaghan had passed completely through the bridge structure, its explosion destroying everything within a 40-foot radius. Secondary explosions from ready ammunition and the ship's own systems had compounded the damage. The entire forward superstructure, from the bridge down 3 decks, was essentially unsalvageable wreckage that had to be cut away and rebuilt from scratch. But it wasn't just the visible damage that shocked the inspectors. Throughout the hull, they found evidence of shell penetrations that should have been fatal. One 14-inch shell had punched through the side armor, penetrated 3 compartments, and lodged, unexploded, in a 4th. Had it detonated, it would have blown open the hull below the waterline and likely caused catastrophic flooding. Another shell had struck near the forward magazine, close enough that the explosion cracked bulkheads, but didn't penetrate into the powder storage. The margin between survival and destruction had been measured in inches. The human cost was tallied in final casualty reports: 77 dead, 105 wounded. Among the dead were both flag officers, the commanding officer, the executive officer's assistant, the gunnery officer, most of the bridge watch, and men from every department aboard. The after-action report, compiled by Lieutenant Commander McCandless and the surviving officers, ran to hundreds of pages. detailing minute by minute what had happened during those 13 minutes of hell. What emerged from the analysis was a picture of how the battle had unfolded and why the San Francisco had survived despite impossible odds. The key factor wasn't luck. It was American naval design philosophy combined with training that had been drilled into every sailor from the day they reported aboard. American heavy cruisers like the San Francisco had been designed under treaty limitations that restricted displacement and armament. But American naval architects had prioritized survivability over other characteristics. The ship's compartmentalization was extensive, over 400 watertight compartments that could be sealed individually. When flooding occurred in one section, it could be isolated, preventing progressive flooding that would capsize the ship. This design principle, learned from studying World War I naval battles, had saved the San Francisco when multiple shell hits below the waterline let seawater pour into the hull. The damage control training that every American sailor received was equally critical. Unlike some navies where damage control was a specialized function handled by dedicated teams, the US Navy trained every man in basic firefighting, flooding control, and repair procedures. When the bridge was destroyed and command structure collapsed, individual sailors throughout the ship knew what to do. They didn't wait for orders. They fought fires, shored up damaged bulkheads, and kept systems operating because they'd been trained to respond automatically. The Japanese, for all their tactical skill and courage, had approached naval combat differently. Japanese warships prioritized offensive capability, more guns, more torpedoes, more speed, often at the expense of protection and survivability. Japanese damage control doctrine relied more heavily on specialized teams rather than universal training. When Japanese ships took damage, the response was often slower, less coordinated, less effective. This difference in philosophy had played out in the Battle of Guadalcanal. The Hiei, despite being 3 times the San Francisco's size and infinitely more powerful, had been crippled by damage that the American cruiser absorbed and kept fighting through. The battle also revealed the chaos and confusion inherent in night naval combat, without modern fire control systems. Admiral Callaghan's force had stumbled into the Japanese fleet at point-blank range, creating a melee where doctrine and training broke down into individual ship actions. The friendly fire that had damaged the San Francisco's steering, the initial confusion about which targets to engage, the loss of formation integrity, all of it demonstrated that night combat in 1942 was barely controlled chaos, where survival often depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information. What made the San Francisco story remarkable wasn't just that she survived, but that her crew had maintained offensive capability throughout the ordeal. Even after the bridge was destroyed, the main battery kept firing. Gun crews who couldn't communicate with any central fire control station engaged targets independently, using local control and their own judgment. The 5-inch secondary battery continued operating. Damage control parties fought fires while shells were still hitting the ship. The engineering department maintained power and propulsion, despite steam line damage and flooding. The San Francisco had been transformed from a coordinated warship into a collection of individual battle stations, yet each station continued fighting. Lieutenant Commander McCandless's Medal of Honor citation captured this spirit, noting that he rendered great service by effective leadership and by the able discharge of his duties. But the citation couldn't fully convey what McCandless had accomplished. Taking command of a ship with no steering, no communication with most of the crew, fires burning throughout, casualties overwhelming the medical facilities, and enemy ships still firing at her, McCandless had kept the San Francisco in the fight. His decision to maintain offensive fire, to keep engaging Japanese targets even as his ship was being torn apart, had contributed directly to the damage that crippled the Hiei. The Hiei's loss had strategic implications that extended far beyond one battleship. Japanese naval doctrine relied heavily on battleships as the decisive weapons in any engagement. Losing the Hiei in what was supposed to be a relatively simple bombardment mission shocked Japanese naval commanders. It proved that American forces, even when outgunned and outnumbered, could inflict catastrophic losses through aggressive tactics and superior damage control. The battle marked the beginning of a psychological shift in Japanese naval thinking, a growing recognition that American material superiority and crew training might overcome Japanese tactical advantages. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the battle's outcome was immediately tangible. Henderson Field remained operational. American aircraft continued flying from the airstrip, attacking Japanese supply runs, bombing enemy positions, and maintaining air superiority over the island. The Japanese attempt to recapture Guadalcanal, which had hinged on destroying Henderson Field through battleship bombardment, had failed. The strategic initiative in the Solomon Islands remained with the Americans. The San Francisco's repair work at Mare Island would take until February 1943. The ship emerged looking almost new, with a completely rebuilt bridge and superstructure, upgraded radar and fire control systems, and strengthened anti-aircraft armament. But she carried scars that couldn't be repaired. In the rebuilt bridge, crew members would walk through spaces knowing that Captain Young had died there, that Admiral Callaghan's last orders had been given from that spot, that 77 shipmates had perished defending those decks. The ship returned to combat in 1943, participating in operations throughout the Pacific. She fought at the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, and Okinawa. She survived kamikaze attacks, typhoons, and continuous combat operations. But for those crew members who'd been aboard during the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, no subsequent action would match the intensity of those 13 minutes in Iron Bottom Sound when their ship had been hit 45 times and refused to die. The crew of the San Francisco who survived that night carried the weight of November 13th, 1942, for the rest of their lives. In post-war reunions, in oral histories recorded decades later, in quiet moments when they thought about the war, they returned to those 13 minutes. Not because they wanted to relive the horror, but because something profound had happened in that darkness. Something that defined what it meant to serve, to fight, when fighting seemed pointless, to keep working when command was gone and death seemed certain. Seaman First Class. Joseph Witt, who'd manned a 5-inch gun mount throughout the battle, remembered the moment he realized the bridge was gone. He'd seen the explosion, felt the ship shudder, watched flames erupt from the superstructure above him. His gun captain had turned to him and said simply, "Keep loading." So they'd kept loading, kept firing at targets they could barely see, kept working until the ceasefire order finally came through what remained of the communication system. 50 years later, Witt would say, "We didn't think about being heroes. We thought about doing our jobs." That's what Captain Young would have wanted. Lieutenant Commander McCandless never spoke much about his Medal of Honor. In interviews after the war, he consistently deflected attention from his own actions to the crew's collective performance. "I gave orders," he said in a 1985 interview. But hundreds of men carried them out in conditions that defied description. The medal belongs to them as much as to me. I just happened to be the senior officer who survived. It was the kind of humility common among Medal of Honor recipients. But in McCandless's case, it reflected a deeper truth. His leadership had been critical, but the San Francisco's survival had been a collective achievement that transcended any individual's contribution. Chief Boatswain's mate Keppler's name appeared in dozens of after-action reports, always in the context of damage control decisions that had saved the ship. Officers praised his coolness under fire and professional expertise, but Keppler, in his characteristic way, saw it differently. In a letter to his wife written 2 weeks after the battle, he wrote, "We did what we were trained to do. That's all. The Navy taught us well, and when the time came, the training took over." I'm proud of the boys. Every single one of them did his job. The letter was matter-of-fact, almost mundane, as if describing a routine training exercise rather than the desperate struggle to save a dying ship. The story of the San Francisco wasn't unique in the broader context of World War II. Dozens of American ships would absorb catastrophic damage and survive through crew determination and superior damage control. The carrier Yorktown at Midway patched up and returned to battle only to be sunk by a submarine. The destroyer Johnston at Leyte Gulf, charging a Japanese battleship force and fighting until she literally fell apart. The carrier Franklin, devastated by kamikazes, yet brought home by her crew. American naval combat in World War II produced countless examples of ships that refused to die and crews that refused to quit. But what set the San Francisco story apart was the convergence of factors that made her survival so improbable. She'd been hit by the largest caliber shells in the battle, 14-inch rounds from a battleship designed to sink other battleships. She'd lost her entire command structure in a single salvo, not just the captain, but the admiral commanding the entire task force. She'd lost steering control, making maneuvering impossible in waters filled with enemy ships. She'd been hit by friendly fire that compounded the damage, and yet she'd kept fighting, kept firing, kept afloat through skill and determination, and a design philosophy that prioritized survival. The Japanese perspective on the battle, revealed in post-war interrogations and memoirs, showed a different kind of shock. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, who commanded the Japanese force built around the Hiei and Kirishima, never understood how his battleship had been so badly damaged by American cruiser fire. In his view, the battle had been a tactical success. He'd devastated the American force, sunk multiple ships, killed an admiral and several captains. But strategically, he'd failed completely. Henderson Field had not been bombarded. The Marines remained, and his flagship, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had been crippled by 8-inch shells that shouldn't have been able to inflict decisive damage. Japanese after-action reports noted the unprecedented ferocity of American gunnery and the reckless aggression of American tactics. What the Japanese characterized as recklessness was actually desperation channeled through training and doctrine. Admiral Callaghan had known his force was outgunned. He'd known the odds. But he'd also known that stopping the Japanese bombardment was more important than preserving his ships. The decision to close to point-blank range and engage in a chaotic melee had been calculated sacrifice, trading ships and lives for strategic victory. Captain Young had executed that doctrine, knowing it might cost him his ship and his life. When he'd ordered the San Francisco to engage the Hiei at 3,000 yards, he'd accepted the near certainty of catastrophic damage in exchange for the chance to inflict enough damage to disrupt the Japanese mission. The mathematics were brutal but clear. A heavy cruiser couldn't sink a battleship in a straight fight, but it could damage, could wound, could create chaos. And in the confusion of night battle, chaos favored the side willing to sacrifice. Young's decision, made in the seconds before the Hiei's 14-inch shells destroyed the bridge, had changed the battle's outcome. The American 8-inch shells that struck the Hiei had wrecked her steering and fire control, leaving her unable to complete her mission. The battleship had won the tactical engagement. She destroyed the San Francisco's bridge and killed the American commanders, but she'd lost the strategic battle. By dawn, she was limping away damaged, and by nightfall, she was sinking. The San Francisco, for all her wounds, was still afloat and would fight again. This pattern, tactical defeat transformed into strategic victory through resilience and damage control, would repeat throughout the Pacific War. American ships would absorb punishment that would have sunk Axis vessels, repair damage at sea that other navies would have considered irreparable, and return to combat faster than their enemies thought possible. The philosophy wasn't about building ships that couldn't be damaged. It was about building ships that could be damaged severely and keep fighting anyway. The San Francisco embodied this philosophy. She'd been designed to survive, crewed by men trained to respond to catastrophe, and commanded by officers who understood that their mission mattered more than their individual survival. When everything that could go wrong did go wrong. When the bridge was destroyed, steering was lost, fires burned throughout the ship, and casualties overwhelmed medical facilities, the crew had defaulted to their training and kept the ship alive. In the decades after the war, the San Francisco became a symbol of American naval resilience. Parts of her bridge, recovered during the rebuild at Mare Island, were incorporated into memorials at naval stations across the country. Her battle ensign, riddled with shell holes, was preserved and displayed. Survivors gathered annually to remember shipmates who didn't come home. The story was told and retold, each telling emphasizing different aspects. The captain's sacrifice, the crew's courage, the ship's refusal to sink, but perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. In 1992, 50 years after the battle, a group of Japanese naval veterans who'd fought in the Solomon Islands campaign sent a memorial wreath to the San Francisco survivors' reunion. The message attached read simply, "To worthy opponents who fought with honor." It was an acknowledgement that transcended nationality, or victory, or defeat. It recognized that on that night in Iron Bottom Sound, men on both sides had fought with courage, had done their duty, had faced death without flinching. The San Francisco herself survived until 1959, when she was finally scrapped after 15 years of service. She'd earned 17 battle stars, more than almost any other ship in the Navy. She'd been present at nearly every major engagement in the Pacific Theater. She'd been hit by shells, bombs, and kamikazes, and each time she'd been repaired and returned to combat. But it was those 13 minutes on November 13th, 1942, that defined her legacy. That was when she'd been tested beyond any reasonable limit, and had proven that American ships, crewed by American sailors trained in American doctrine, could absorb catastrophic damage and keep fighting. The USS San Francisco had entered Iron Bottom Sound as a flagship carrying an admiral and a Medal of Honor recipient captain. She'd emerged as a burning wreck with no bridge, no steering, and 77 dead. But she emerged. That was the difference. The Japanese had hit her 45 times with shells designed to sink battleships. They'd killed her captain in the first salvo, destroyed her command structure, left her wallowing in circles surrounded by enemy warships. By every measure of naval warfare, the San Francisco should have rolled over and sunk within minutes. Instead, she'd kept her guns firing, kept her engines running, and kept afloat through sheer refusal to accept defeat. Lieutenant Commander McCandless had taken command from a secondary station with no communication and no steering, and he'd fought back. Chief Keppler had directed damage control through chaos and darkness, making split-second decisions that saved the ship. Hundreds of sailors whose names never appeared in official reports had done their jobs, loading guns, fighting fires, treating wounded, keeping systems operating, because that's what they'd been trained to do. The San Francisco didn't survive because of brilliant command decisions made from the bridge. She survived because when the bridge was obliterated, the crew kept fighting anyway. This story isn't really about one ship or one battle. It's about what happens when doctrine and training are tested beyond their design limits. The Japanese believed in decisive engagement, in concentrating firepower, in using superior weapons to achieve quick victory. The Americans believed in resilience, in damage control, in building ships that could absorb punishment, and crews that wouldn't quit. On November 13th, 1942, those philosophies collided at point-blank range in the darkness. The Japanese won the tactical engagement. They sank ships, killed admirals, devastated the American force. But they lost strategically because the Americans refused to accept tactical defeat as final. The San Francisco absorbed 45 hits and kept fighting. The Hiei inflicted those hits and still ended up at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. That difference, the ability to take catastrophic damage and continue the mission, would define the Pacific War. Japan built elegant ships crewed by skilled warriors. America built tough ships crewed by trained professionals who understood that survival mattered as much as victory. But while the San Francisco was proving American cruisers could survive impossible punishment, another ship was being commissioned that would take the concept of refusing to die to its absolute extreme. The USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing barely 2,000 tons, would face an entire Japanese battleship fleet at Leyte Gulf in 1944. She would charge battleships that outweighed her by 30-1, firing until her guns were literally torn from their mounts and continue fighting even as she sank. Her captain would earn a posthumous Medal of Honor. Her crew would prove that tonnage and firepower meant nothing compared to courage and determination. The Japanese commanders who witnessed her final charge would salute as she went down, acknowledging they'd witnessed something non extraordinary. If you want to understand how American naval crews won the Pacific War through sheer refusal to quit, make sure you're subscribed. I analyze battle reports, Medal of Honor citations, and survivor testimonies to uncover these stories of impossible courage. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss it.